After a painful breakup, Melissa decided she needed to put the past behind her, every little thing that reminded her of him. She boxed up photos. She deleted old texts. And she took off the beautiful ring he'd given her. With a heavy heart, she walked into a prestigious jewelry store, hoping to get a few dollars and close that chapter for good. But when the jeweler examined the ring, his reaction was immediate and strange. He gasped. He left the room. He returned with a folded piece of paper and a look that made Melissa's stomach drop. What happened next would pull Melissa into a mystery far larger than a stolen piece of jewelry. Within hours she would be sitting in an interrogation room, the ring at the center of a 2-year-old museum heist that stunned the city. This is the story of a ring, a robbery, and the way one woman's decision to move on set a decade of secrets unraveling. Stay with us. Melissa hadn't planned to sell the ring. It had been tucked away in a jewelry box for months after the breakup, the kind of keepsake you can't quite throw away even when you want to. She had been with Steve for 4 years. In that time they shared everything from cheap weekend trips to quiet Sunday mornings. The ring was supposed to be a promise, or at least a symbol, a lovely band with a center stone that threw off a little constellation of light when she turned her hand in sunlight. But promises had a way of wearing thin. Steve cheated. It happened suddenly, and with an intimacy that cut deep. Her best friend. Melissa remembers the texts she couldn't unread, and the sounds of laughter that suddenly meant betrayal. When the relationship ended, the ring became a weight. She told herself she'd salvage something practical from his mistake. She could use the money for rent, for a month of therapy sessions, or even for a small, desperately needed escape. So she dressed in something simple, wrapped the ring in tissue, and stepped into the city. Walking into the jewelry store felt strange. The polished glass and hush of wealth, the soft lights that made every gem appear precious. Mr. Harris greeted her with a practiced smile and a hand that made him look like he'd been in the business his whole life. He took the ring with gloved fingers and moved it under a loupe. Melissa watched the jeweler work, the tilt of his head, the focusing of his eyes. And then his reaction changed everything. "Wait here," Mr. Harris said. "I'll be right back." He disappeared into the back room with the ring in his hand, leaving Melissa standing by the counter, more puzzled than patient. The hum of the store narrowed to the tick of her heartbeat as she listened to the sounds of him rummaging, the whisper of drawers sliding open, the clink of metal. He muttered to himself. He was trying to be discreet. Or maybe he wasn't. Melissa tried to steady her breathing. She asked if everything was okay. He reassured her, though his voice trembled. Then came his return. Footsteps, sudden and quick, and a folded piece of paper in his hand. The paper, folded, guarded, made Melissa's curiosity sharper than her hope. "Where did you get this ring?" he asked. She answered the way anyone would, that her ex had given it to her. That wasn't unusual, and in another life, it would have ended there. But Mr. Harris hesitated. He asked whether she knew where Steve had bought it. Melissa didn't. He invited her to wait, offering tea, insisting he call a colleague for a second opinion. Melissa sipped warm tea and let her mind wander to fantasies of new beginnings. In that half hour of waiting, she pictured how she might spend the money. She didn't notice the shadow crossing the doorway, because she didn't expect anything to happen. She certainly didn't expect a police officer to stride in. The paper Mr. Harris carried contained a photograph. Or at least, Melissa thought so. He wouldn't show it. He kept it folded, close to his chest like a small secret. When the police arrived, Mr. Harris pointed, and a comm shop became a theater. An officer approached Melissa, polite but unyielding. "Ma'am, we need you to come with us to the station." The words felt surreal. She hadn't stolen anything. She had come to sell. When the officer spoke of asking a few questions, Melissa believed him. After all, if she could only explain, everything would be fine. But at the station, the questions came lined up and serious. Agent Davis, soft-spoken but direct, sat across from her alongside Agent Johnson, who was quieter but keen-eyed. They asked about the ring. They did not accuse her of theft. Instead, they spoke of history. "This ring isn't just jewelry," Agent Davis said, and Melissa felt the room shift. It's an artifact. It belongs to a collection. It was reported stolen from the Metropolitan Museum 2 years ago. 2 years. That timeline made Melissa's breath catch. 2 years ago meant things she hadn't considered, a news story she might have skimmed, a theft that seemed distant from her ordinary life. The ring, as it turned out, was not merely valuable in carats and clarity. It had provenance, name, crown, lineage, and the story behind it was woven into centuries of ownership. Melissa listened as the agents described a temporary exhibition where rare objects had been displayed under heightened security. Motion sensors, guards, locked cabinets. The theft had been clever, and it had gone cold. No direct leads. No arrests. Just a hole in a display case and a list of priceless items gone missing. Mr. Harris, it turned out, had read about that theft in a trade magazine. And when Melissa placed the ring on his counter, he recognized the design, not just because it was ornate, but because his eye for historical pieces flagged something subtle, a hallmark, a sculpting style, a micro-engraving that matched museum documentation. Melissa's mind supplied images of Steve carrying a small box into their flat. The triumphant look on his face, the pride with which he'd set it on the coffee table. She'd assumed the trinkets in his strange collection were souvenirs, bits of thrifting luck and estate sales. That assumption now felt naive. And yet the agents were careful. "We don't think you were involved," Agent Davis told her, searching her face for panic rather than guilt. "But we need to know how this ring came into your possession." It was a reasonable question, but it felt like an accusation. Melissa's memory, at once foggy and sharp, reached back to small details she'd dismissed. The night Steve came home smelling of city rain but with an edge in his voice. The times he disappeared for hours and returned with a story that didn't match the time he'd claimed. Memories became clues. Clues became a map to a man at the center who now looked very different to her. Agent Davis proposed a risky plan. Melissa would contact Steve and arrange to meet him, in public, wearing a hidden microphone. They'd listen in. Undercover agents would be stationed in and around the venue. The idea was to prompt Steve into revealing something incriminating without tipping him off. Melissa felt both fear and a strange, fierce clarity. If Steve had lied to her, if he had stolen this ring because he wanted to impress her, then she owed it to herself to know the truth. And if he had stolen it for other reasons, greed, ego, a compulsion, the authorities needed to stop him. The preparation was meticulous. A technician fitted Melissa with a tiny microphone and earpiece. The agents rehearsed possible lines, how to steer the conversation, what to say if Steve grew suspicious, how to signal for extraction if things went sideways. It was all business, clinical, calm. But for Melissa, the stakes were painfully personal. "You'll be safe," Agent Johnson told her. "We'll be listening to everything. If he becomes violent, we'll move in." Her role was simple in instruction but heavy in consequence. Be natural, bring up the ring, listen. Let him speak. She sent the message to Steve, casual, almost flirtatious. "Hey, it's been a while. Fancy a drink?" She told herself the lines. She imagined the bar, the warm lights. She thought about the times they'd sat across from one another, holding hands, making plans. But things had changed. The ring had acted like a magnet for trouble, and now their next encounter would happen under watchful eyes and waiting vans. It was an ambush dressed as closure. O'Malley's was the kind of bar that kept the city's quieter stories inside its walls. Anniversaries, whispered apologies, secrets traded over late-night fries. Melissa arrived early and sat at a corner table where she could see the entrance. Agents took positions. At the bar, near exits, a table over. An officer sat close but acted like any other patron. Cameras were in place. Radios were muted but ready. When Steve walked in, the old chemistry flickered for a heartbeat. He smiled the way he used to, easy, slightly embarrassed, like a man meeting an old friend. He slid into the seat opposite her, and their small talk began with a familiar cadence of shared history. Old jokes, mutual acquaintances, the kind of stiffness that occurs when two people who once loved each other are learning to be strangers again. Melissa steered the talk gently toward the ring. It arrived naturally, a passing mention, a reminiscence. remember that ring you gave me? It was so pretty. He shifted. He laughed. He deflected. Melissa kept it light, almost fond, coaxing. And then he said, "It's a long story. I didn't buy it. I took it." For a second, the air itself seemed to hold its breath. Her ears filled with the muffled hum of the bar. The microphone picked up the words in clear, intimate focus. Steve's voice, private and confessional, became a recorded admission. He explained, halting, human, ashamed, how he had crawled under the museum wall late one night, bypassed censors, and taken the ring because he thought he needed something spectacular to prove his worth. Then everything moved faster than Melissa's mind could keep up. The doors burst open. Agents moved. Badges flashed. Steve's eyes went from stunned to pleading. He tried to claim he was only talking, that words couldn't be arrested. But the agents had more than words. They had a recording, photographs from security footage, and the ring itself. He was cuffed. He was read his rights. The bar fell silent. Patrons stared. Melissa sat frozen, wrapped in a cyclone of relief and grief. The man she'd loved was being led away for a theft that had, in a way, defined their lives together. Under the harsh lights of the station, Steve finally opened up. His confession was ugly and tender both. The compulsions that had driven him, the thinking that one grand gesture could rewrite his life. He told the agents about planning, about the night he went into the museum. He described Toole's ease, the way his hands shook when he finally held the ring. Not with triumph, but with a sudden, sharp understanding of what he had done. He had hoped the ring would impress Melissa. He had hoped it would be proof that he could provide, that he could be the man worth loving. Instead it became an anchor that dragged him down, a guilty possession that made him paranoid, a secret he couldn't stop protecting. Melissa's testimony, when she gave it, was clear and quiet. She spoke of the night he gave her the ring, of the small joys and the betrayals they'd shared. She told them she had never asked where it came from. She told them the truth. Together, the confession and the testimony were enough. The case that had lain cold for 2 years finally had a living thread, motive, confession, and chain of custody leading back to Steve. The ring, returned, would go back behind glass. Steve, remorseful and now legally accountable, faced the consequences. When the ring returned to the museum, it came with headlines and cameras. The theft had been a story in the paper. The recovery was a story on main news. Reporters clamored for interviews. The museum called it a moral victory, the return of a priceless artifact and a hint of closure after an embarrassing theft. For Melissa, the publicity was not a victory. She never wanted the spotlight. Her role in the recovery, accidental, messy, and ultimately courageous, made her name a byline on other people's stories. She fielded calls from producers, gave terse press statements, and then retreated to the only shelter she could find, anonymity. But the public reaction was complicated. Some sympathized with Steve, a man who thought he could fix his worth with a bauble. Others condemned him as the petty criminal who had violated public trust. Many focused on Melissa, bewildered, at the center of a heist story she never asked to be part of. Social media did what it always does. It tried to make sense of the narrative in a handful of memes and 10-second reactions. For a woman who had only wanted to sell a ring, the consequences were disproportionate and disorienting. Melissa struggled with the attention at first. Interviews felt invasive. The looks in the streets felt heavy. People would whisper or stare, or overhear a snippet of her name in the news and tilt their heads. She took measures to reclaim herself. Counseling, long walks, and small acts of autonomy. She started therapy and, slowly, found the words to process what had happened. The court case unfolded as such cases often do, tedious, exacting, and public. Steve entered a plea. He acknowledged guilt and asked for leniency on the grounds of remorse and a troubled life. Prosecutors argued that theft of museum artifacts was not victimless. These objects were cultural touchstones, often on loan from private collections and conserved with meticulous care. Taking them out of context breaks historical continuity. It robs the public of its shared heritage. Melissa was subpoenaed as a witness. She sat quietly in the witness stand and recounted the small details. The ring, the jeweler's reaction, the conversation in O'Malley's. Her testimony was steady. It was also, by the court's measure, consequential. The judge listened to Steve's life story, his compulsions, his attempts at reform, his confession. They considered probation, public service, possible restitution to the museum for security improvements, a sentence that weighed both accountability and the possibility of redemption. In the end, Steve received a sentence that reflected his confession and his cooperation. Time that would allow for rehabilitation and a requirement to help pay for tightened museum security. He would have to live with what he had done, publicly apologize, and accept the legal consequences of a crime that had begun as a private act and rippled outward to touch more lives than he had ever imagined. Melissa watched from the gallery as justice was served. She felt relief, but also a new emptiness. The man she had loved had been unmasked. The man she had once planned a future with was now a cautionary tale. After the court case, Melissa stepped out of the frenzy. She had to rebuild, not just a life but a sense of self. She started therapy in earnest, worked through the betrayal and public exposure, and slowly found a different path forward. She signed up for dance classes even though her first twirls were awkward and unsure. She took a solo trip to a coastal town she'd always wanted to visit, and in the solitude of hotel beaches at dawn, she began to feel the edges of herself return. Melissa also launched a small online business selling handmade accessories, a little venture that felt safe and predictable in the best possible way. Money from the ring had long since been returned. Instead, she applied her energies to creating something of her own. Her public statements became gentler over time. In interviews she spoke about responsibility, about the complicated way love and shame can coexist. She spoke about how the ring had become more than a piece of jewelry. It had been a portal into a crime, a stress test of character, and ultimately a lesson. She told reporters this: "I never wanted the spotlight. I just wanted to live my life. What matters is that something important was returned, and that the right thing happened in the end." It was a modest statement, made with dignity and humility. This case raises questions that go beyond one ring and one arrested man. Why do objects hold so much power? Why does a single item draw people into risk and secrecy? For Steve, the ring represented worth, something to prove with, to hold up as proof that he could reach another class of life or love. For the museum, it was part of an educational collection. For Mr. Harris, a jeweler, it was an item of craft and history. For Melissa, it was a symbol of a past relationship. Objects are mirrors. They reflect how we see ourselves and how we want to be seen. They are currency for identity. When someone like Steve feels diminished, he might look for quick ways to fill the void. For him, that meant theft. When the narrative became public, many people were tempted to simplify the moral. Steal and you'll get caught. Betray and you will be found out. But the truth is messier. Steve's story is a portrait of a man who wanted to matter and made a terrible decision in the belief that an object could give him the meaning he sought. Melissa's role, unwitting, then courageous, shows the strange moral clarity that sometimes emerges when ordinary people are thrust into extraordinary situations. She could have walked away. Instead, she chose to cooperate, to risk discomfort and publicity to help fix something broken beyond repairs of a relationship. Months turned into a year. Steve served his sentence, performed community service, and met with therapists as part of his rehabilitation. He apologized publicly and privately, and accepted the consequences. Melissa continued building a quieter life. She found friends who supported her. She traveled, she danced, she worked on her business. She learned to speak about the experience without being consumed by it. In time, the sting dulled. She told herself she had gained something intangible, a clearer sense of boundaries and the courage to reclaim her story. At the museum, the ring sat under glass with an upgraded security label and a wall plaque detailing its history. Teachers led school groups past it now, and the children asked the same questions. Whose hand had it rested on? What era did it come from? And why was it important? People will always be tempted to assign simple meanings to complicated lives. But this story, about thefts, about love, about secrets held in the ring's tiny engravings, resists simplification. It asks us to look closer at the reasons people commit crimes and the messy human motives driving them. If you take anything from this story, let it be this. Objects tell stories, but it is people who carry them, and it is people who must answer for what they do with them. If you found this story compelling, please like and subscribe. Share this video with someone who